get started. Thanks everyone for patience. We've been talking about doing an event like this for probably close to a year now, I think, between Mike Hathorn and John Coppage and I, and it's pretty exciting to actually have it happening. So thank you all for coming, and look forward to a really great evening of really good discussion, trying to tackle some of the biggest struggles but most important things that we can be talking about as a city, and that's quality, affordable housing, and the role that can play in creating strong communities. I'd like to thank our guest, our moderator. Dina will be doing the introductions, so I won't duplicate that. I'd also like to thank our CNU annual sponsors, WSP, Daybreak Communities, and the University of Utah College of City and Metropolitan Planning. We wouldn't be able to function without sponsors, and we're grateful for them. And if you're interested in being a sponsor of CNU Utah, come talk to me after this. Just my quick thoughts on this event and the importance of CNU Utah and the role that we play is that there are a lot of issues that cut through party lines and are just human issues, and CNU really hits on those issues. And I think in today's, I think it's safe to say, we live in a fairly politically divisive time. That's an understatement, but I think there is a large group of people that really are just hungry for solutions-oriented discussion and organizations, and this requires getting people together who you don't necessarily agree with, talking to people who have views and ideas that maybe you don't agree with, but still staying at the table and staying engaged because you have the common goal of wanting a great community, a great city, a great region. And so this requires listening, it requires caring about the other people and the things that they are important to them, even if they aren't necessarily important to you. And we believe that CNU Utah is one piece in that puzzle of helping to fill that void. And we're here to provide nonpartisan, multidisciplinary forums to exchange ideas and set an example for passionate yet respectful debate on challenging issues facing our cities today. We're grateful that all of you are here to participate in that. So one last thing, just a quick plug to sign up as, if you're not already a CNU member, to sign up as both a CNU member and as a chapter patron. The benefits include the ability to combine together with people from a variety of disciplines, including students, work together to improve the way the Utah communities are built. Find outlets to collaborate with planners, architects, engineers, landscape architects, developers, public officials, and others. If you sign up as a CNU Utah patron, you'll be invited to some patron-only events that we'll be holding, and then also the chapter patrons will be recognized on the CNU Utah website, which has recently been launched at cnuutah.org. So enough of me talking, you can come to me. I'll turn it over to Dina.
I'd like to thank John Larson, who's the chair of our board of trustees at CNU Utah. So my name is Dina Blaze, and I'm a former board member of CNU Utah, and really I'm very honored to be asked to participate as a moderator for today's event. I do want to take a minute. John already recognized our sponsors. We can never thank them too much. WSP, Daybreak Communities, and the Department of City and Metropolitan Planning at the University of Utah. We'd also like to thank those who are participating with us today. We have an exceptional and really interesting group of experts here today. And before we begin, I want to go over just a few logistics for everybody. Restrooms are across the atrium down in the basement. Please, if you have a cell phone, turn it off. Or we can follow the Park City Council rule, which is if your phone goes off, you buy everybody dinner in the room. So it's up to you, but I think turning it off might be a better option. The Wi-Fi is available if you go to, you should see it as SLCPL_public is the Wi-Fi access here. It doesn't require a password. And our format today, we're going to begin with brief remarks by our panelists, followed by a discussion among them and myself. We'll take about a 10-minute break. And I would encourage you, if you came in, there were some 3x5 cards and pens. If you want to jot down some questions, we're going to be gathering up those 3x5 cards during the break. And that's going to sort of usher us into what we hope to be a very robust question and answer period after the break. One thing I should say, there's also going to be a CNU Utah hosted gathering with our speakers after the event over across the way again in one of the conference rooms on the other side of the atrium. So let's get started. This afternoon we want to explore the relationship between conservative values and the development of affordable housing. And that, of course, is a starting point. I don't doubt, however, that the discussion will venture into the topics of wages, government mandates versus the free market, regulatory and land use schemes, the Federal Housing Administration, and the role of urban design, among others. Our title for this event is Delivering Community, Making It Happen in a Red State. We clearly intend to explore these issues within the context of conservative values and ideology. But what do we mean when we say conservative? Generally speaking, we mean values that include decision-making, control at the most local level, respect for tradition, custom, and convention, prudence as it relates to long-term consequences of our decisions, disdain for uniformity and a one-size-fits-all approach, the link between freedom and property, limiting government intervention, and the notion that the best solutions are reached voluntarily. Now, undoubtedly, the principles I just enumerated may irritate some of you because I may have forgotten your favorite one, or I struck a nerve if you don't agree with those principles. So I don't want any emails, citing sort of an American Spectator article that might point out what those principles are. It certainly was not an all-inclusive list. It's just a general understanding of some of the core principles that I think are part of the conservative ideology in the United States and of course in Utah as well. But the reality is that CNU Utah is seeking to explore the opportunities and the challenges that are associated with strengthening communities in a red state, where we tend to approach those solutions through those filters. We just want to be clear and very upfront and transparent about the context for our discussion today. So our philosophy with this event is also to cover as much ground as possible. We're going to fill the time with a lot of substance. So we have specifically asked our speakers not to go through a primer. I'm going to introduce them. We don't want to spend too much time them introducing themselves and giving me their bona fides, so I'm going to do that. We want to jump right into the topics. And if it's a little bit over your head or we can't keep up, that's what Google is for. Jot it down, Google it later, but we really just want to focus on substance. So we have asked these three panelists to share with us very briefly 5 or 6 minutes of their very strong point of view on these topics, and then we're going to jump into that discussion. So let's get started. Heath Hansen was born and raised in Cache Valley, Utah. He graduated from Utah State University with a bachelor's degree in psychology and law and constitutional studies, and a master's degree in political science. He currently works for Senator Mike Lee as a legislative assistant. Prior to that role, he worked on Senator Lee's Joint Economic Committee staff as a policy advisor and helped write the recently released report, What We Do Together, the State of Associational Life in America, which I hope he's going to talk about today. Right? And currently he lives in Maryland with his wife and 2 daughters. Next, we're going to hear from Derek Monson, the Director of Public Policy at the Sutherland Institute. He oversees Sutherland's strategic policy and legislative initiatives. He has influenced a variety of public policies in Utah, including tax and spending policy, government transparency, education, Medicare reform, and immigration. He's been published in Public Budgeting and Finance, the Washington Examiner, the Federalist, Utah Policy Daily, and of course, our daily statewide publications. He has a bachelor's degree in economics and political science from Brigham Young University, and is completing a master's in finance at the University of Utah. And Jonathan Coppage is a visiting fellow with the R Street Institute, where he studies regulatory obstacles to the traditional walkable neighborhood development patterns that strengthen communities both socially and fiscally. He's a contributing editor to the American Conservative magazine, where he edited the New Urbs project before joining R Street. He has also been published in the Washington Post, First Things, and National Review. He's based in Washington, D.C., and has spoken on urbanism and mixed-use development at events across the country, and we're glad you can add Salt Lake City to your list. So let's get started.
All right, well, thanks, Dina. It's always great to come back to Utah. I'd like to give it every chance I get. So I'm a relative newcomer to housing and urbanism issues. Most of the experience I have with these issues have come in the last few months when I was working, as Dina said, on Senator Lee's Joint Economic Committee staff. So Senator Lee is the vice chairman of the Joint Economic Committee, and earlier this year he started the Social Capital Project in that office. And we reached our first report just last month. What we do together, the State Association of Life in America. There are copies up on the table up there. I hope everyone was able to get one. If not, it's available on Senator Lee's website, lead.gov. Go ahead and check it out there. The impetus behind this project and this report is there seems to be a sense that our social fabric is weakening in America. So often when we discuss politics and public policy, we tend to focus on two extremes. We talk about the individual, we like to talk about individual liberty, and we talk about people being able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, things like that. Or we talk about the state or the federal government. Everything the federal government's doing right, or it's doing wrong, what it should be doing, what it isn't, things like that. What we often ignore, though, in our public discourse is the middle layers of society between the individual and the state. And so that's really what this project is designed to do, is to shine a light on those intermediary layers of society, institutions like family and religion, communities, neighborhoods, clubs, all the things that fill that space, that civil society between the individual and the state, because that's really where our society gains its strength, and that's where our social fabric is woven within those intermediary institutions. So that's the perspective that I come at these issues from, more of a sociological perspective. So I'd just like to go over a couple of the findings from our first paper. What this first paper does is we kind of take a broad view of the state of social capital in America, and we look at 4 different categories. We look at family, religion, community, and work. We just kind of look at different indicators and how things have changed since the 1970s, just to kind of get a snapshot or an overall view of how our associational life has changed over the past 40 years. And a couple of the findings that I think are pertinent to our discussion today. So American adults are spending less time socializing with their neighbors today than we did in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, 30% of American adults reported that they had spent at least several times a week socializing with their neighbors. In 2016, that number had dropped to 19%. Another interesting finding is that although racial segregation in our communities has fallen, class segregation is increasing. So in the 1970s, about 65% of American families that lived in the largest metro areas in the country, they lived in what would be classified as middle-class neighborhoods. And with the remaining 30-35% living in either poor or affluent neighborhoods. As of 2014, that almost flipped. Only 40% of American families lived in middle-class neighborhoods, and about 60% occupied the spaces in affluent or poor communities. So we're we're dividing ourselves along class lines now, rather than race-based lines, as much as we did in the past. And finally, another concerning finding is that our social trust, the trust we have in each other, is declining. In 1972, the number of people who said that most people can be trusted was at 46%. By 2016, the number had fallen to 31%. And also in the 1970s, the number of people who said that they trusted the judgment of the American people with regard to current policy issues of the day was at 83%, and last year that had fallen to 56%. So we're not trusting each other, we're not spending as much time with each other, and we're also dividing ourselves along class lines. And so when it comes to housing policy, I think it's important to not only, if we want affordable housing, obviously we need to increase the quantity of housing, but we also need to increase the quality of our neighborhoods and the quality of the development. So this is where we're talking about missing middle housing, where we can provide a bunch of different forms of housing across a bunch of different price ranges in order to integrate our communities a little bit more, and also to encourage people to get out and associate with one another, so we can start building that trust again, and so we can ultimately heal our frayed social fabric.
All right, so I think Jerry Seinfeld captured my views on public speaking when he cited a survey on the issue of public speaking, saying that people fear most public speaking, number one. Second, death. And so his joke on this is that it means if you're at a funeral, you'd rather be in the casket than giving a eulogy. That's kind of how I kind of feel. So bear that in mind as I speak. So I think where conservatism has a lot to say on affordable housing, it begins with the focus or the drive in conservative thinking and principles on the reality that people live in. Whether it be in the document in history or in the world that we are in right now, avoiding abstracted things that don't necessarily have a connection to realities that are just about what we wish was the case. And so I think there's three areas where I thought I wanted to address when it comes to that. The first is the regulatory space. So I think, in order to have affordable housing, you have to have regulators that limit the scope of their action to practical consideration, not the ideological ones. What does this community need? What are the people who are in this community, what do they think? Those kinds of things, rather than say maybe a political agenda they might bring to the table. And then, on the same token, allowing markets and communities to really drive processes and regulation of housing. So we actually had a great example of that. We met today with a Salt Lake City planner at a development just southwest of here around the track station. And you can tell, just the more we talk about different developments that are going in, different units that are being built, a lot more multi-family units, that he saw his job as helping things actually happen in the community, based on what the community was like, as well as what the developers that were coming to him were interested in doing, within, of course, the bounds and the scope of city ordinance. I think that's a great example of what a regulator should look like. Grounded in practical considerations, trying to really facilitate affordable housing options rather than, say, personally trying to block the ones they don't like or encourage the ones that they think are the best person. In the developer space, I think there's a lot here, specifically dealing with community-driven solutions. So I actually spent a lot of my day this afternoon speaking with a local developer here, and he emphasized, which I think is right, the importance of developers to work with the communities that are trying to develop a community or develop a housing unit in. So rather than say coming with all your plans, figuring it all out, going to the city, and then just dropping it on the community at the very end when it's about to happen, or say midway even through the process. You start by going into the community, showing them some rendering. Okay, here's what I want to do. Hold a public meeting so people can understand, and you avoid some unnecessary rejections of what would otherwise be a good set of housing options. this middle housing area. And then again, maybe on top of that is building our developments in ways that respect the local traditional look and feel of the communities we're in, rather than trying to change them. You see a lot of the latter going on in various areas, and that might have kind of a fad feel to it, right? It looks great, it's new age, but again, a lot of times communities reject it, and rightly so. They don't care about new age; they care about their community, what it looks and feels like. And then secondly, those things can quickly go out when the next fad comes along. And then I'll close talking maybe a little more nationally. I think in the financial space, there's room for conservative values to really create affordable housing options. In that, we really, despite all the federal or the financial regulations that passed out of the financial crisis, we haven't resolved many of the core issues that drove the financial crisis. We still have a system that is both in the regulatory and the market space that personalizes the benefits of finance in the housing area and socializes the costs. And so you see then, even in the wake of that crisis, skyrocketing housing values that is in part, I think, driven by these underlying fundamental dynamics. Whereas if we got that the right way, as opposed to getting it backwards, you might have a more reasonable set of affordable housing options and cost growth in housing arena. And maybe just my closing point would be, amidst all of this, I think there is a need for a sense of humility about what we really understand when it comes to these issues, whether it be in the markets and the regulations. Again, the housing crisis, financial crisis is a great example. We thought we knew everything that was going on. The regulators did, the rating agencies did, people buying their homes did, and then when we realized we didn't, there was a lot of pain. But maybe as pertinent to the housing sector, you have things, for example, in technological development, such as, if you're familiar with this thing called Hyperloop, right? This idea that is, according to the technological developers themselves, is within a handful of years, 4, 5, 6 years of actually transporting people using their cars. You go into a loop that's maybe built underground, it shoots you at 150, 200 miles an hour on your commute. You come out and you drive to your work. And they believe they're ready for this to go. And I'm not saying that's going to be a technology that becomes actually practical. Who knows if it pans out. But what it should suggest to us, I think, is if those kinds of technologies come into place, what does that mean for affordable housing? When you can live, say, in Brigham City or Cache Valley and commute to Salt Lake in 20 minutes. That completely changes what we think we understand in regards to what affordable housing means and what proper development means. And so I think, again, we don't know what's going to happen, and that's the point. Is keeping that in mind as we come up with plans, because a lot of times we're planning 10, 20, 30 years in the future, and recognizing that it could be completely different than what we expect. Thank you.
So, thank you, Dina, and thanks, John, for helping put all this together. I've very much admired a lot of what's been coming out of Utah, what's been coming out of Senator Lee's office, and the work that they do down at the Sutherland Institute, and so it's a treat to be able to be here. I promised Dina I wouldn't do a primer. I won't, but I will start with the context that I work in. So I work at a think tank in Washington, D.C. And as Dina mentioned, my focus is on the walkable sort of traditional urbanism that was time-tested and strengthened communities in many ways. And the reasons why we've gotten away from it, some of which are free choice and market-driven, but a lot of which have been substantial government choices. And there's one in particular that I've been working on that shows a lot of how small decisions taken from a high place can have cascading, snowballing effects for decades and shape the environment in which we live. And one that I work on is mixed-use development. We're in CNU, Utah, so I know everybody here is a big fan of some good mixed-use development, and has probably run into some of the issues of financing that development when many of the standard programs, whether at the FHA or through Fannie or Freddie, all of the different ways that the federal government has entered the market since the New Deal in order to try and expand affordable housing as an option for people, it has done so by picking a particular fashion that it thought was good, which was the single-family home. And so we got a lot of that in the post-war period. And we needed a lot of that. We needed a lot of everything in the post-war period. We had, a generation coming out of a depression, coming out of a war, and they needed a place to live. But because they set up these emergency temporary measures in keeping with what they thought was just ideologically, as Derek was mentioning, the best, they cut the legs out from under the organic, mixed-use development that could be built incrementally and that could gather over time, that small actors could build and could have gradual intensification of their towns and places. And so, over the course of 80 years, a lot of that financing dried up, a lot of that development dried up, and that's why the new urbanists came along to wave their arms one day and say, hey, we lost something. How can we get that back? And what I think is really important when we're talking about housing affordability and the built environment is that a lot of the attention goes straight to the highest possible level. Low-income housing tax credits and other federal solutions that can be implemented at large scale in a place. They're allocated to the states, which then give them to, pick the projects that can build a lot of these below-market developments. And when you look at how housing was built before these went up, there was a lot of it that was affordable by design. And that is one place that we have gotten away from, is building buildings that are designed to be affordable. Instead of having a standard set of, a single-family house on a large lot, you have the ability to have, as we saw when we were driving around, a great bungalow court, where you have, 8 two-bedroom units, so that's 16 people on a single-family lot. Those are smaller units. They're able to be afforded. They were able to be built because they weren't illegal yet. And we've gotten away from allowing developers to build that stuff. And when they do, often the only people who build it are the large developers who will master plan a very large area. And it's good to have large developers. It's good to have big people to do big jobs. But when we're talking about housing affordability in community, what's really important to me is that you see some of this coming from the local level. And that it is important to have small actors to operate within the bounds of the default, that where they can develop things by right, where they don't have to hire squads of lawyers to shepherd their little quadplex through. And where people can build houses at scale themselves to build for their neighbors. And one of the things I think it's so important to have small-scale incremental development is to have that ability for citizens to build for their neighbors, to have equity in their place, so that you're not relying on large actors from elsewhere to determine the future, but rather that individual actors can shape and take equity in the future of their community. Salt Lake City is an interesting place, and as we were driving around, it was interesting to note it's famed for its blocks. It's famed for its streets, and they're huge. They are, in many ways, the opposite of small. And I've gotten into some arguments, as I was telling John, with other new urbanists who say Salt Lake City, it's lost. You can't save Salt Lake City. The blocks are too big, the streets are too big. You know, too bad, they're nice people, but what are you going to do? And the great opportunity that Salt Lake City has is that it has these blocks, which, as we saw one of the developments just going up across the street from those micro units, you can drive straight through them and create another street. You can do a road diet like the one on Broadway, and it's beautiful and it's fantastic, and you have a lot of space to work with. And so, like, in a lot of ways, I think Salt Lake City in particular has a lot of room to do small things because it has big blocks, big streets, big problems, but big enough to work in.
Thank you. Great. One of the things that you all three mentioned that I'd like you to talk a little bit more about is you sort of set out the premise of what some of the challenges were and some of the problems. And I know, Jonathan, you have written a lot about what are the specific things that local entities can do to make those changes come about. So I'd like if you could, all three of you, talk a little bit about the greater detail. If there are specific changes that could be made within the Federal Housing Administration or the lending community that might make that difference. And Heath, your mention about the missing middle, and it makes me want to ask is that class segregation, sort of which comes first? Is it the housing that's causing that segregation, or are there other elements within the social fabric that your report may have brought up that are just causing us to sort of move in that direction? Is it the political climate and so forth? So what I like is you made some good opening remarks, and I'd appreciate it if you would sort of now take that next step into the deeper understanding of those elements that you raised.
Can we start?
Sure.
So I think in the national housing world, or financial regulation world, there are various aspects of regulatory policy that ought to be changed. So again, I think, Dodd-Frank did some good things. It didn't really solve any of the real problems. So, and there are other options out there. The Choice Act is one that has some good things. I'm not going to tout any previous legislation as a silver bullet. It's not. But when you don't have policies in place that allow a financial institution to fail in the right way, but instead you kind of leave the situation such that the only way they're going to fail is they're in a crisis, and that could create a crisis that's bigger. And that's kind of, I think, where Dodd-Frank is. Maybe another example is in the Choice Act allowing large financial institutions to declare bankruptcy and go through that process in a way that's unique for financial institutions, but then prevents maybe the crisis from spreading because it can be done in a reasonable and positive fashion for the rest of the system, even though that bank is going down, rather than what we saw, say, with Lehman Brothers, when that bank went down and then everything just went crazy. So I mean, that's a specific example, is how we deal with financial institutions that fail. And I think that's important here because there is a lot of risk in financing housing and real estate development. That's just the nature of that market. And so you have to have policies that reflect that risk rather than, again, socializing it, because we're really not dealing with failing institutions in a way that allow us to reasonably personalize those costs. And so we have to come in and bail them out, because otherwise the whole system potentially could collapse.
So with the class segregation, there's a lot of different factors at play there, obviously. One of the things that is likely some of the increase is the mortgage interest deduction, where the federal government allows mostly higher income earners to deduct their mortgage interest from their home. And so this benefits people who make more money than 5% deduction, while completely ignoring middle class and especially lower class people that either don't earn enough money to take that exemption, or they rent because they don't own their own home. So that's part of what's driving inequality. Also, there was a study done by a scholar at the University of California, I believe, Anna Owens, and she looked at the social segregation and what was driving it. And she found that it could almost entirely be attributed to families with children who were moving to more affluent parts of neighborhoods to get into better school districts. So that's the largest driver, so it seems to be the school district. And then obviously there's probably zoning issues there that maybe the affluent people they move in and they don't want anyone else to move in because they've got a pretty cushy position for kids in their schools, and so they tend to
So it perpetuates that segregation.
Yeah, and as you say, a lot of zoning bakes this in because people want a monoculture of large houses that swell larger thanks to that mortgage interest tax deduction. But there are a lot of ways that you can start, even in small ways, to undo that. And one is accessory dwelling units, which New Urbanism has been a big fan of for a long time. And I know that Salt Lake passed an ordinance trying to get some ADUs started a few years ago, but hasn't gotten a lot of them built. And that's one of the big challenges that it faces. And this is a project that we've worked on at our street, where you see this problem all across the country, really. People are starting to appreciate that having a smaller unit that's in the back of a single-family home is very gentle density. It's not that scary, all things considered.
Well, I think all of us have seen the other side of that coin, which is many neighborhoods, I'm sure, have experienced a lot of infill where an older house, 3 older houses in a row are purchased, torn down, or scraped, and you get 9 units. That's much more disruptive to the fabric in terms of increasing density within that neighborhood than what you're suggesting, correct?
Right, exactly. Adding 1 unit is less disruptive than scraping and putting in higher density, certainly. But a lot of places have adopted these codes that are just too burdensome. ADUs are a unique part of the housing market where a lot of times these are not built by pros, not just built by the sort of people in this room, but that a lot of people build for themselves, take home equity loans out to build. And because of that, there's a very high potential to scare people off with barriers to entry. They don't know their way around the permitting office. They don't know their way around the zoning code. And so you have to streamline your code down to the bare minimum and then actively produce resources to guide them through that. And places that have done that, places like Santa Cruz, California, which has maybe been the most aggressive place in the country, have seen production of ADUs surge. They subsidize them also a little bit. And so that raises another issue. What's always interesting and ironic to point out is that the city that has the most libertarian accessory dwelling unit ordinance in the country is none other than Portland. That famed right-wing outpost. But, I was talking to the mayor who got that done recently, and he said, he put it up, and there wasn't a big fuss yet, and so they just sort of slid it through without a lot of the additional owner occupancy requirements, without a lot of the parking requirements. You don't have to have any parking requirements, no owner occupancy, anything. You want an accessory dwelling unit, basically you build it and they're good. And so you've seen a surge, far and away the most ADUs being built anywhere in the country are being built in Portland because they just get out of the way.
Well, do you think, though, Portland might also have an issue with their density boundaries? I mean, they have geographic challenges. They made decisions to, protect some farm area that's adjacent to Portland. So part of it, I wonder if they truly have embraced that philosophically, or if it was sort of, that's what was left in terms of the choices.
Right, exactly. Exactly. They have a very strict urban growth boundary, and Chuck Marone just, I think recirculated a piece he took, sort of taking issue with Portland's self-love of how it is done. You're right, it has tremendous weird restrictions. That urban growth boundary chokes it off and keeps you from continuing to build And then they have these very intensive transit-oriented developments where all of a sudden you have density just crashing down into a place. And you've had very, rising home values that have been pushing people into all sorts of places. And so ADUs were, one of the only ways they saw to let that go. They also just passed something, and I'm glad you brought this up because it reminded me, they just passed a 20% inclusionary zoning ordinance, so that multifamily buildings have to set aside 20% of their stock to be at 60% or below their median income.
Did they give them a density bonus as a result of that? Or is it just a mandate?
I think there's a combination. But what you've seen from the folks I've talked about there was a big surge just before the inclusionary zoning requirement went into effect. And now all the multifamily architects are scraping for work in other towns because there's been a depression, because it dramatically raises the cost of doing that. And inclusionary zoning is really popular and is sometimes inoffensive with sufficient density bonuses. But one of the reasons why I'm very skeptical of inclusionary zoning requirements, and I know Salt Lake is considering them in its housing strategy process right now, is that what I talked about the importance of having small actors and the importance of having increments where you develop over time and you have a single family that you maybe break into a duplex and a quad, and then you build a 3-story walk up. Inclusionary zoning falls, races into the arms of the big, where in order to make it possible, you have to get more density, and so you have to get even bigger, and then you will have more expensive market rate houses. Market rate apartments with the truly subsidized stuff. And that, to me, is not how you solve, is not the best way to be solving the sort of economic segregation that he was talking about. It's not to take a few poor people and drop them in a luxury building. It's to build communities where you have a housing stock that is diverse by design, and you've built enough of it so that you don't have huge distorted markets where as soon as you build anything, it's going to be snapped up. If you try and do it just by forcing or regulating it into existence, I think it's far less likely you're going to get actual social cohesion in a way that bridges those economic chasms that our piece report pointed out.
One thing I will say, I think that maybe this is an alternative, so I don't know if this is great, that's what you just said, but so there's a program Salt Lake City has. They have a community land trust where they actually own homes in various neighborhoods throughout the city. And these homes are quote unquote sold to people who are either homeless previously or low income folks. And they build equity by paying what effectively is a mortgage back to the city for those homes. And the whole point is they're supposed to build up equity like a rent-to-own kind of situation, so that when they sell the home, which again maintains it's under the city's ownership the whole time, that they can then go on and get into their own situation. And the benefit I think of that is if you bring people who are in these kinds of difficult situations into communities that are more economically diverse, even if it's a one-off situation like that, they have the opportunity to build the networks, to build the job opportunities simply by associating with people who have those job opportunities or know of them in ways that otherwise you can end up with simply affordable housing options that are effectively one building of all affordable housing, but then get stigmatized as being, that's the affordable housing, and stay away from that area. And I think that's a program that's innovative. I'm not as a conservative, I'm hesitant about the idea of the city owning all these homes, but I love that they're trying to find ways to integrate folks economically in ways that would be beneficial to them and help them to move up the economic line.
Well, one of the other points that I think, and Jonathan, I think you wrote about this in an article you did last year. In North Carolina, I know that they have instituted a sort of almost a, I hate to say it, but it's sort of a punitive approach to either vacant buildings or vacant land as infill. Because what you're getting at is having to do with infill. Smaller scale actors that are coming in and able to infill. I mean, I think Salt Lake City, most of the East Bench, we're not experiencing the kind of problems that Portland is, but we know they're not far off. We know what our growth is going to be. We know we're going to hit those mountains on the other side eventually. I mean, Riverton, Harriman, Bluffdale can continue to carry some of that, but we know we're going to have to look back and see what's happening on the East Bench in some of the cities. So my question is sort of that kind of approach, and if you've seen that and seen any success in that.
Yeah, I mean, it is, this gets to the, one of the weird cross-cutting ideologically cross-cutting dreams, which is the land value tax, of taxing land values instead of property values. And one of the benefits of that is that, you can leave something as just a surface parking lot or a vacant lot, but if it's valuable, you're going to be paying taxes on it, so you might as well build on it. And that's very sensible. I think lots of places would benefit from seeing that implemented. And I think it always gives, you see that from the furthest right to the furthest left, people getting on board with a land value tax. And so if we could ever actually get this into the mainstream political discussion, maybe tribalism would, lead us to say, oh, if he's for it, I'm against it, but at least there's a chance there.
Well, we'll have to call it something other than the tax, I think. And then on that note, I want to promise that we were going to be taking a break, and we want to take the questions that the audience has written on those cards. So we are going to take a brief 5 to 7 minute break. And if I could have some help from CNU board members to gather up any cards that have questions, we're going to sort of come back after the break and go right into some of the questions that the audience has. We're not going to limit those questions on the card. We do have microphones here, so if something sparks a question or an issue that you'd like to raise while we're talking, don't hesitate to come down. But let's just take about a 5 to 7 minute break.
How you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing. I'm doing.
Did you see there's a, I was just showing to you this.
Spot here a little bit. You don't have to do this, but there's no way we're going to get to all these questions. And I'm wondering if you guys would be willing maybe to respond to them in writing, or if we can pose them at a reception or having a little gathering afterwards. I just think these are some really good meaty questions, and I hate that we can't get to all of them tonight. So if there might be a willingness to respond to them in some way, maybe CNU can put it on their website as a blog, or you can figure out how to get those available. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to start. Some local planning ordinances inhibit affordability and and density. Some state legislatures across the country are discussing forming local jurisdictions to lessen these barriers or take some of that control back. Is that a solution?
So I was reading yesterday that Oregon's legislature is actually discussing a bill that would preempt local zoning ordinances in the case of developers who want to build affordable housing. And so this really comes down to how far do we want to take the localism, subsidiarity, which is a very interesting topic and one that I need to think about more.
Yeah, this is, I think, one of the most interesting questions facing the country today. How about that? I'll just throw that out there. Because it really gets to the appropriate level of governance. And what we have done for the past 50, 60 years is prioritize the absolute closest level of governance, so that the neighborhood regulates itself, basically. And local people can have great veto power over what their neighbor does with their property. And there is a strong case for localism in that. And a lot of this came out of a time when there was far too much centralization. I don't know if anyone here has seen the new Jane Jacobs documentary. But I saw it recently actually in the West Village, in Greenwich Village, which seemed like the right place to watch it. And you saw a lot of Robert Moses's bulldozing a lot of places, and it required the local community to rise up and stop it. And so they got a lot of veto power rightly. But now we have to look at and confront the very dicey question of what happens when you have a neighbor vetoing people from developing their own land? And what happens when you have a neighbor keeping people out of a place? And what is the level of governance that is appropriate to serve the common good? And so Oregon, far and away, has the most aggressive bill on this that is going through. And I find myself deeply conflicted on it, because I am a localist. But you also see a number of, especially on the coasts, a number of cities that have gotten so far gone in their distorted markets and zoning that they are truly in crisis. And I know Salt Lake is approaching crisis level, but the specter of San Francisco is out there to show what happens when nothing moves. And in California, they are having that very debate, as we speak. There's another watered-down preemption bill there as the state tries to force towns to build, because the state knows that it has to build housing, and somebody has to do it.
Well, that brings up something that you mentioned, Derek, in your opening statements about the need that you see in developers sort of going into the community or I wrote down kind of getting that community input earlier in the process. I mean, I've served on community councils. I think a lot of people here have probably been active in their neighborhoods. And I don't think I've ever met a large-scale developer who's enthusiastic about going to a community council meeting or neighborhood meetings. And I hate to sort of generalize that, because I know I'm wrong. I know there are some that don't mind that process, but my experience has been one of, gear up, put the shoulder pads on, go in and tell the community what you're trying to do. But I think you touched on something really important if you want to sort of expound on it, which is not telling them what they're going to do, but really seeking authentic input about what that local community might need, which I think is very much in keeping with CNU, deep CNU principles.
Yeah, well, I think this is an issue that isn't just unique to housing. This is one of the political problems we have, is we simply don't want to talk to each other anymore. We want to talk at each other and have the other person acknowledge us, but we don't really want to talk to them and listen. And so, yeah, I think, well, the reason that's important is because when you actually do have these conversations with people, where you are genuinely listening to them and say, okay, what does the community feel here? I want to build a multi-housing unit or a multi-family unit. Help me understand what the community looks like in perspective. When people have those kinds of conversations, you tend to find all manner of agreement and things that you can work with. And it's the hesitancy to have that conversation that leads to the division, because we never even approach coming together at a point where we can then say, okay, we have these handful of things that we just disagree on, a lot of work goes out. But I can augment my development here, or the person's like, well, I actually like this aspect of your development there. And then you have something to build on, rather than, again, rushing in and saying, okay, here's what I'm doing, and I hope I don't get protested out of the room. And that's kind of oftentimes what happens.
Developers should be prepared to come to communities and explain how the developments are going to benefit the community. So it's not just an adversarial thing where, the developer comes in and says, I want to build a multi-family housing unit. Immediately, community members might just think of, some big, hideous brick building that is going to be off on the community. Well, if the developer comes in and explains, no, this is what it's going to look like. I'm going to try to develop it so it's in line with, community values, how the community looks, and it'll be a lot easier.
Maybe part of this, and one more thought, is depending spectacular high-rise that would be a big, bold, brash statement. Instead, they did something else. And I think that's kind of the question. If you're a developer coming into a community to say, I want to make a big statement with my development, saying this is what new age functioning looks like, but it's in a community that doesn't care about that at all. It's in a community that cares about themselves, and they want the look and feel of their community to be what it is. If you can come in and say, I want to fit into that, and that's the statement I'm going to make, is I want to improve your community, help your community be what it should be, what you want it to be, not simply what I want to say it should be.
Right, and what I think is really important is a process issue for private actors. A lot of architecture is planned and developed, you know, on a table or on a screen, and it's a building and it's a statement. And I don't want, far be it from me to blanket smear architects, not least because I'm guessing I'm outnumbered in this room. But it is important for plans to be developed in their context and in dialogue with their environment. And we have lost the idea of the public realm as a place. It's ironic, at the very same time that we want to regulate our neighbor, we've lost the sense that the street and the facade and everything is in fact a part of a public commons. But I do want to push back as well, because as I'm sure everyone here knows, just going out and having the conversation isn't always enough. And especially when you get to richer and, dare I say, more liberal areas, that's in the statistics, you end up with a lot of places who say, I'm very in favor of this stuff being built in principle, but there's just this one problem. You know, always one more problem if you're trying to build it near me. And in California, you see, California is a great example to use because it's all of our problems magnified. And they just had an AIDS nonprofit is the biggest NIMBY lobbyist in the city of Los Angeles, and it put on a measure to halt almost all development in the city because they feared that there was going to be some development in Hollywood that would stand up between their headquarters and the Hollywood sign. And that's a problem. Fortunately, it was put down in large part thanks to a lot of community activists in an organization called Abundant LA, who said, we need housing, we need this stuff to happen, and we need buildings everywhere. But you can also have places, there's another area in Pasadena, I think, where I read a specific story of a Swedish developer who was coming in to develop, mixed use, grocery store on the first floor, some apartments above. And the very wealthy community has a very long history of extorting developers. And that's what it is. They come in and they say, okay, well, it's nice that you want to build that. But if you don't want us to sue you via CEQA, their environmental regulation, for 30 years, you're going to need to spend $1.5 million here and devote another $3 million into this community fund that pays us each 6 figures. And he walked out of that meeting and remarked to a reporter, he couldn't believe he was in a first world country. The shakedown was something he didn't think happened in a first world country. And so we have to be able to take hard governance questions of where should the decisions be and where do we have checks on each other? Because that's one of the great lessons that is built into our national governing structure, the idea that we always have checks and balances among each other. I think that thinking often has been too little applied down to the structures in which we govern each other more locally. And with regards to housing, it may be that it's needed.
This is a good question. It's going to have a couple of points to it. Conservatives would argue government should not be the business of housing. How can we shift responsibility for affordable housing from government to private enterprise? And I want to bring up a couple of points that I think also come into play with this topic. And that is, since the 1960s, the share of renters paying more than 30% of their income for rent has more than doubled to almost 49%. For the Salt Lake metro area, the area median monthly housing cost is $930. And renters paying more than 30% of their income in rent is up to 46%. 20% of those folks pay more than 50% in rent. So what I'm getting at is I can understand this question of government not being in the business of affordable housing, but how do you deal with those market gaps? If you are looking at a complete free market approach and your wages are not keeping pace with your housing costs, which we know have risen, household income, increased by 18% since 1960. But the inflation-adjusted rent went up by 64%. So how can we take it away from subsidies of government, which you had all talked about a little bit before, touched on or alluded to, and really put it in the realm of free market when you're looking at those kinds of wage problems?
Yeah, I think the beginning of that answer to that question is recognizing the long-term nature of all of this stuff. Right, we didn't get to the place where we are today in going through, say, suburban development in a couple of years. This is 40 or 50, 60 years, right? And so a question of that level is probably several multi-decade answer, right? Which means that we don't have all the answers today because we can't foresee that much in the future. But I think it begins with things like, again, financial regulation as it hits the housing sector that personalizes the cost. Because one reason why housing costs have gone up so much is because those who finance the housing developments don't have to pay all the costs of those developments in many cases. Or not of the developments, of the financing. And so they can take a lot more risk than they probably should. And you don't have to have a regulator necessarily coming in and saying, this is how much risk you can take, and that's kind of what Dodd-Frank is trying to do, right? Stress testing, we'll decide. But the reality is we don't know how much risk each bank can handle. And so maybe we ought to just say, you know what, you're going to suffer the consequences of taking too much risk. And then it's up to you to figure out. And if you do, then we're going to have a reasonable process to get you out that's going to effectively disrupt your business and not make the taxpayers pay for it. So I think it starts with things like that. The underlying fundamental issues is what I'm getting at. And maybe more broadly, the culture and the governance culture, for instance. So one reason why the government, I think, is involved in housing is it sees itself culturally as, and this is true on both sides of the political aisle, right? George W. Bush was very big on home ownership, and he made sure his policies reflected the government getting involved in encouraging home ownership. And is that bad necessarily? Not, again, it depends on how you do it. But if you create a culture that says the government's job is to make sure you are in a good home, well, it doesn't matter what your policies are, they're going to reflect that cultural value, and that's something that needs to change too.
And also, if you want the free market to basically get government out of the business of providing housing, you need to unleash the free market to be able to provide housing at more affordable price levels. So, when early 1900s we had a bunch of immigrants coming from Europe who had basically nothing, they were able to build homes in cities. They didn't have government subsidies. Obviously, they weren't always the best quality. We don't want to have the same quality of those houses, but there's a lot of things we can do to trim our building codes, get rid of all these parking requirements, all these requirements that the government places on developers that increase the cost of housing. If you want the private market to supply housing at more affordable rates, make it cheaper to build housing. I'm not saying get rid of all government regulations, but obviously we make sure people are safe, these houses are structurally sound. There's a lot we can trim from building codes that make housing a lot cheaper to build and therefore a lot more affordable for lower income people.
Yeah, and so one thing that's important to say is that you are never, and census agreement, you are never going to get to a place where the market produces 100% of housing for all people if you have the sort of codes that we talk about of wanting there to be a certain level of fire safety, a certain level of housing safety, and everything like that. Right, exactly. And so there's going to be a government created floor, and so there's going to be a government role for taking up that question. But we have a sizable gap right now between that basic floor and the operational floor in which we live now. And one of my priorities is digging into a lot of history that you talked about and showing all of the different housing forms that we used to build that were more affordable. The ADU is one, and is a great one, and is the starting point. But it's the accessory dwelling unit isn't the only thing we've regulated out of existence. The single resident occupancy hotel, the SRO, is nobody's favorite housing structure, but we have seen a essential, almost eradication of them as a housing form in the United States, in North America. Vancouver is one of the few places in North America where it has not completely disappeared. But there's a famous story of, in the 80s, when they were sort of catching up with a lot of the zoning fashion, there was one particular neighborhood in East Vancouver, I believe, that had very high concentration of SROs. It had among the lowest homeless population in the city. In the 80s, they caught up. They got rid of all of those, SROs that, good upstanding people like us came in and said, no, this, people shouldn't have to live without, having an entire home in a box, like an apartment. And I'm sure, there were issues present in those SROs themselves. But when they got rid of them, like happened when you saw the redevelopment and urban renewal here in the U.S., they got rid of them. There wasn't as much of an emphasis on how to house those people. They got rid of the SROs, and the homeless population ticked right up. And so what's important is creating as many housing units that have as many low price points as possible. And there may be a role for subsidies and having, I'm a bigger fan of having housing vouchers so that you can have people access the private market rather than publicly produced housing, because it's not a core competency of government to get into the construction business, and it does it at exorbitant costs. Whereas if you relax a lot of these markets and allow micro units and cottage courts and everything like that, you can create smaller units which rent for cheaper and cover a lot more of the spectrum naturally, rather than relying on very complex government subsidies.
Okay, we are actually running out of time, and I apologize. We had some excellent questions, and like I said, I'm going to encourage the CNU board to consider a way that we can publish those questions and ask for your responses. But I did ask the three panelists if they would be willing to just take a minute or two and kind of provide some closing remarks. They could be sort of what you have thought about today that may be different. It could be sort of Hail Mary, what Utah should be doing the very next day if we all walk into the store and want to try to make change. The other is maybe another topic that we all should think about as we go forward. So I'm going to give you each just about a minute and a half for closing remarks. And then I just wanted to say that CNU Utah is hosting a gathering with our panelists just across the atrium downstairs in one of the conference rooms. So follow the path of individuals going. And again, I just want to thank our sponsors, WSP, the Daybreak Communities, and the College of City and Metropolitan Planning at the University of Utah. But I'll turn the time back over to you, gentlemen.
All right. So thank you again for hosting this. This has been a wonderful time. I've very much enjoyed it. We've gotten a lot into the weeds in particular issues, and so I'll just close remarking on the role of conservative values in this. And what I think is important to recognize, and what I've found in my work, is though a lot of urban concerns are often occupied and advocated for by people left of center, the importance of a walkable community is about the strength of a community, and is about the sustainability of that community. A lot of people think of sustainability as just about the environment, and particularly in places like Utah, it's important to be cognizant of the water use and modes of sustainability like that. But traditional development is also about fiscal sustainability. It pays for itself to have a lot more people along a certain segment of pipe. To run it out and disperse it, you're almost always going to end up upside down. And so, as conservatives, finally, I think, get back into this discussion where we've unfortunately left it alone for too long, it's important to recognize that affordable housing and the issues of community form are both questions of how you build things for people to come together, and how you build things so that people can pay for them for generations to come.
Yeah, thanks again for hosting this, and having a lot of fun being part of this panel. So back in BC, in Senator Lee's office, we often talk about the Utah model. Senator Lee talks about this a lot in his speeches. It's because Utah does a lot of things exceptionally well that other states just haven't quite figured out. So just last week, for example, we had a hearing in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Senator Lee chaired this hearing. And the purpose of the hearing was to highlight collaborative partnerships between federal government and state government. And so we had witnesses from the Forest Service, from the Bureau of Land Management. I don't know if anybody here knows Tyler Thompson. He's from Utah's Department of Natural Resources. We also had a witness from Idaho. And all of the witnesses, even Idaho witness, were just gushing about Utah's ability to create collaborative partnerships. Not only within the state, but also with the federal government. Utah has just figured out how to work together and how to solve solutions locally. Not top-down mandates, but through bottom-up, grassroots input from a wide variety of stakeholders. And so I have no doubt that Utah is going to be a leader on this housing issue, much like it is with most other issues. So as someone who eventually wants to move back to Utah, I am very much looking forward to what Utah does, and yeah, just excited to see what Utah has in store for the rest of the country.
Yeah, so I think there's two actionable things really. First, and these are both mentioned, but looking at how our laws and regulations eliminate housing choices, whether they be building codes that we mentioned or zoning regulations, and then secondly, reach out to someone who disagrees with you on this issue and begin a dialogue about it. And honestly, like a real dialogue about it, because really in our world today, that just doesn't happen very often. And on an issue like this, there's no excuse for that, because everybody wants more affordable housing options for people. And so I think if we reach out to people, whether we're conservative talking to liberals or liberals talking to conservative, about how we can find solutions, I think we're going to find solutions, and maybe even find innovative solutions, because we'll build off of each other's ideas rather than rejecting them.
Thank you very much. And thank you again to CNU for hosting today's event.